Welcome to Lessons That Last, where a researcher and a teacher talk about what it means to make a lasting impact on students' lives. They unpack the stories former students shared about their memorable teachers and discuss how we can all make a greater impact on the people in our lives. Here's Julie and Laura.
Hello, and welcome back to the Lessons That Last podcast. I'm Julie Hassan, professor, researcher, and with me is my lovely podcast co-host,
Laura Estes-Swilly. I am an English teacher and a writer and a really avid reader.
So we've been talking about reading lately in our personal conversations, and we haven't necessarily made these public conversations.
Right.
But the story that you chose today is one of my favorite stories because it centers around one of our favorite books.
Yes.
So I feel like I have to ask you, what is it like right now going into a new school year, being a teacher of literature in the state of Florida?
So I try really hard to maintain positivity, but right now it is hard to be a teacher in Florida, period. And I think it's very difficult to be a science teacher in Florida, very difficult to be a civics teacher in Florida. And it's a hard climb to be an English teacher in Florida right now because of the new laws that passed. And I think that there's a lot in the national news about the new laws. And it's really basically one law, but it has like 25 different parts to it. I read the law, it's 20 pages, and I wanted to share it with my students, especially my AP Literature students, because we don't really know what to read at this point, and you have to read something. And so I was like, let's get them on board with looking at the law. But once I realized it was 20 pages long and I didn't want to abridge it for them, I dismissed that. So the law basically says that anything we read has to be completely free from sex. Anything having to do with gender, orientation, sexual orientation, or the very traditional sexual aspects of a love relationship. And that has presented a lot of challenge for the districts in Florida because the law is very clear, and then it's left to the districts to decide how to police that and what we are and aren't allowed to read.
And I know in Florida, talking to my friends who teach civics, history, social studies, that race is also a hot banned topic in Florida.
It is, but that is not part of this law, which is strange that it is such a hot button, and there is this attempt to really control how those issues are dealt with, but it's not part of the law.
And I started thinking about all the books I loved coming through middle school, high school. And in almost every piece of literature I loved, there's either race or gender, because I don't know how you write about the human experience without those themes.
You don't. And that's the problem. So as an AP teacher, I started the school year literally not knowing what I'm allowed to teach. And I need to start our first book, and I don't have super clear guidance on what I am allowed and not allowed to do. So I am going with what I read. I read the law. And I understand the law, and I'm not a lawyer, so I'm sure that there's something I'm missing, or it wouldn't be so complicated because it feels very complicated. But I am choosing my texts in order to avoid breaking that law. And you know me, and our listeners are starting to get a feel for my personality as well, I'm sure. I'm not always the best rule follower, and I like to push limits, and I like to, test a little bit. But the penalty for this law is significant. It's a third-degree felony, and that means prison financial fines, many, many years of probation, and I would guess maybe loss of my pension. I'm starting my 24th year. I can't imagine losing everything that I've put into this, along with my freedom, over a book. Now, books are so precious to me. They mean almost everything. And so I'm in this very precarious position. And I think that thousands of teachers in Florida are in this position right now.
Wow. Okay, so let's recap this. We're talking about putting teachers in jail if they teach a book that someone would interpret as a violation of this 20-page law.
Yes.
That basically says any book with a sexual or gender theme.
Well, not even a theme. It doesn't have to be as big as a theme. It just has to be there. Yes, yes.
And what book that's young adult or adult fiction doesn't have that kind of
nothing? There's
context.
Nothing. Literature is about the human condition, and the human condition includes those real, very real things. And with College Board, in the last 5-6 years, they've revamped some of their ideas about the curriculum and how we should be teaching, or what we should be teaching. And I don't want to say require, because require is strong for the way they present it, but they want us to teach contemporary literature. At least one novel or play needs to be contemporary. So within maybe the last 5 years. So I don't know if you've read a lot of books lately that were really current. Most of them, there's nothing. There's just nothing.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm even thinking like popular fiction where the crawdads sing.
Oh, no.
No, I mean, you couldn't teach that.
No, but they teach it all over the country. Many of my peers all over the country and in international schools are teaching Where the Crawdads Sing, but not here now. Not here, not now.
I mean, that theme is pretty clear in that book, right?
Yep.
Wow. And I'm thinking about the books that we were taught growing up. Middle school, high school, middle school, 7th grade. Mrs. McCoy, To Kill a Mockingbird is like the first real fiction novel I remember reading. And that one, certainly race is a central theme of that book.
Absolutely. And that's a problematic in some parts of Florida. And I think that there has been an attempt to rein that in. Last year, Florida rolled out for English the best standards, which is a lot of people are familiar with Common Core. So this is Florida's answer to that. And for English, they gave literal writers and titles to choose from. So they're telling us exactly what they want us to teach.
So I'm guessing Harper Lee was not on the approved list. Because I can't remember any book we read that was real fiction that stuck with me, that didn't have something uncomfortable in it. The whole point of it is to walk in someone else's shoes and feel uncomfortable, right? Like,
yeah, absolutely.
As a teacher of literature, what is the point of literature if it's not that?
Correct. There you go. This is what I've been struggling with. And I just started school last week and talked to my students about reading and the importance of reading. And basically what I told them is, no matter how big your life is, you're only going to travel your path. You cannot know the millions of other paths that are out there. Even if your life is huge and you go in all the places and you do all these amazing things, there are going to be things that you're just not exposed to. And you can know all of that through literature. Because when you read it, it is very real because it lives in your head and sometimes it stays in your heart. For example, To Kill a Mockingbird. And that's what's important about literature. If we're not reading things that are very real, then we're wasting our time.
Yeah. And as a young white woman, reading To Kill a Mockingbird made me think about what it felt like to be in a different color skin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And reading things like Catcher in the Rye made me think about what it felt like to be in a different gender.
Right.
And there's no way I would have known those things except through literature.
Right. So for me, in a lot of ways, it's Toni Morrison. I call her Mother Morrison because I think for a writer, she is that spiritual mother, that guide, and that nurturer. And I have learned so much from her books that I feel like I understand people every day in my life more because I've been exposed to Toni Morrison.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And I love her as well. All the things, Beloved, The Bluest Eye, like so many good works from Mother Morrison. What do you think it is that has people making these laws and pushing these book bans so afraid about literature?
It's kind of hard to answer because my answer is probably more scathing than I would want to just like put out. But I think there's a giant fear on the part of a swath of our society that their children will be homosexuals or transsexuals or experiment in any way with their own gender and with the ideas of love. And so these laws are designed to clamp down on that because there's this belief, and you and I know differently, and everyone listening knows differently because we're educators. And so we know about dealing with kids, but there's this belief that if we take it out of their realm, then they will never know. They'll never question gender. They'll never wonder about sexuality or anything in that realm because we haven't given it to them in a book.
In a book.
Right.
Which is so carefully crafted. And I think that we put it in their hands in social media. You know?
Right.
But in art, we're going to say no. Like, you can't have access to that.
Right.
Wow.
And I think so I was trying to make sense of this, and I refuse to be a proponent of this, but I do have to help my students understand why we're in this situation. And I do understand that there's a lot of fear out there. And I think that part of the issue is if you're receiving it at school, in your school library, or your teacher is handing it to you and saying, this is a book we're going to study, then there's a legitimizing of something there with a person in power who's saying, this is what we're reading, you have to read this. That this type of law takes that away. The books are still out there. The kids can still get them in many ways, but it's not us handing them over. It's not discussing these issues in the classroom.
That's so interesting because as teachers, so often we feel so powerless. And this is sort of an acknowledgement of the power we have in the classroom,
it's true.
right?
It's true. I don't think they mean it to be an acknowledgement at all.
I'm going to take it as that.
But you're right. You're right.
Wow. And all of it, when you teach literature, one of the things you teach about is conflict, right? And people trying to navigate a conflict, whether that is racial or gender or economic.
Mm-hmm.
there has to be, if it's any kind of compelling literature, some kind of human conflict in it. Like, how do we only teach things that make people comfortable? I don't even know what's left. Even when I think about teaching second grade, I don't know what's left if we take out all of that discomfort and conflict.
I agree. For me, art has always been for making you think. It is supposed to make you uncomfortable. If you're engaging with art on any level of depth, you will not be comfortable the entire time. And that's the job of art. And that's the job of the consumer of art, is to be open to that discomfort, be open to looking at an idea from another perspective in the context of the time it was written. That's such an important part that we leave out. So yes, conflict and also context. And it's okay to be a little uncomfortable. That's okay. And it makes me sad that we're taking that away from people.
So in the story we're going to talk about in this episode, it centers on a book that you and I both love.
Yes.
And I remember reading this in, I want to say, 8th grade, Mrs. Lamb's language arts class. When do you remember reading this book?
I remember reading it in Mrs. Huff's English class, also at junior high. I don't remember the grade. So if you read it in 8th, I must have read it in 8th grade as well. And I remember being so moved by it. The symbolism was so rich. And I was in love with this book, and I was in love with writing. And I know you remember very clearly my passion for this book. So it was definitely in Mrs. Huff's class.
Oh, Mrs. Huff, she was so sweet. And you and I were lucky because I think, baby, we were in high school when the movie adaptation of this book came out. And I want to say every heartthrob,
yes,
when we were teenagers was in this movie. So Patrick Swayze, Rob Lowe, Tom Cruise, right?
Yes.
Ralph Macchio, who
Leif
else?
Garrett.
What?
Yeah. Leif Garrett was a Soch.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
Diane Keaton.
Yes.
Oh my goodness! Like, who wasn't in this movie?
Yeah.
Emilio
Estevez.
Yes. Oh my gosh! And I remember you and I went to this movie together.
And so I remember very clearly we were not driving. So I think it had to either be early in our sophomore year or, well, yes, because anytime in our sophomore year.
Yeah, because by junior year I was driving. So
right.
Yeah, it had to be 10th grade, maybe 9th grade, 10th grade.
Yeah. And because I remember standing outside the movie theater waiting for our ride, one of our parents, in the rain.
Or my brother.
Or your brother.
We'll hope it was my brother. Probably so. Oh my gosh, that brings back so many sweet memories of this movie. And always the book is better than the movie. And in this case, yes. But this movie was pretty well done.
This movie was excellent. Excellent. One of the things I did with my AP students, just to get them writing and to see their writing, like how do they put words together? How do they put paragraphs together? Is I gave them they had to write about 3 books, their favorite book of all time, a book that changed them in some way, and a book they just couldn't like, even though they wanted to. And
that's so good.
Yeah, I was really happy with the way that came out. And then on the second day of school, we just kind of went around, what's the favorite book? And we shared our favorite books. And one of the kids said The Outsiders. And so we had a big meeting of the minds there, and we talked about the movie. And so I would say a lot of those kids went home to see if it was on Netflix because we were loving it so much.
So I will say you can rent it on Prime.
Okay.
Because when I heard we were doing this story, I had to watch it again.
You did?
I did.
Was it wonderful?
Oh my gosh, it's still so good. And let me tell you, when they do Nothing Gold Can Stay,
yes,
still cry.
Yes.
every single time.
Mhm.
Like, just so good. And then I have memories of you and me sitting in the theater and you overcome with emotion yelling, "Do it for Johnny."
Do it for Johnny. We're going to do it for Johnny. I was all in on that.
But when we think about this book and this movie, there's all different kinds of conflicts and discomfort.
Mhm. Yes.
But, two different economic realities. So you've got a group of really struggling, economically disadvantaged kids and a group of economically advantaged kids, and the conflict in many ways lies in that, right?
Yes.
And so I wonder, is this a book we're going to continue to be allowed to read in Florida? I don't know.
That's a great question. We'll see how it shakes out. And I think one of the problems that we're having is every district has to figure this out for themselves.
Wow.
And
so you've got to interpret a law
yeah,
as a school district.
Mm-hmm. And listen, I'm going to say I'm grateful that they are, because what if it was left up to us in our individual classrooms to try to figure out how to navigate this?
I mean, and you risk going to jail.
Right.
We're threatening teachers with, let's just be really clear about this. In Florida, we're threatening to jail English teachers if they teach a book that is deemed inappropriate.
Correct.
Including Shakespeare.
Including Shakespeare. That is true. That is true. And I think we all know that there are some books that we don't want to teach in the classroom. I mean, that's just, I love books as probably more than most people. And there are books I would not bring to my classroom. They belong in a different place. If the kids read them, awesome. If they want to talk to me about them, even better. But they're not right for everyone. And so I'm smart enough not to bring that into my classroom. And so you can be selective without being threatened with prison.
Right. Because you are a professional.
Correct.
And
Correct.
you have discretion and professional judgment.
Yes. Yes, we do.
Yeah.
Thank you for realizing that. Anyone who wants to say that out loud is welcome, because right now we're a little beleaguered here.
Yeah. Well, I will get my #TrustTeachers going again.
Yes, and your megaphone. You need a megaphone. Yes.
Always. So in the meantime, will you, Laura, share Tessa's story about her 7th grade literature teacher, Mrs. Linn?
Yes. I was always a proficient reader. I never remember struggling to decode the words. Reading was my escape, and I loved getting lost in the stories. But I became a different kind of reader when Mrs. Linn introduced me to The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton in 7th grade. When we began the book, Mrs. Linn instructed us to keep a journal of questions we had while reading. By the end of chapter 1, my journal was already full of questions. I wrote questions about prejudice, about violence, and what makes people family. Before The Outsiders, I was often assigned questions about my reading that had literal answers, which could be found right in the text. The questions in my journal didn't have easy answers. Our class had rich discussions about the questions in our journals. Sometimes we disagreed, but Mrs. Linn never said anyone was wrong. She said that writers don't always give us the answers. Great writers often leave us with more questions. I credit Mrs. Linn for my continued love of reading and for all of the questions written in the margins of my books.
Oh, Mrs. Linn.
Yeah.
Tessa, and I love writing in the margins of books.
Me too.
And
me too.
All the sticky notes, right?
Yes. I was thinking about this story, and one of the things I share with my students every year, written by a professor, a literature professor named Mortimer J. Adler. And it's an article, How to Mark a Book. And he goes through all the different ways you should mark a book. And absolutely, you must mark a book. And if you've really read a book, then you can't lend it to someone, because it's like lending them a piece of you.
Oh.
And I thought Mrs. Linn was ushering her 7th graders into that understanding of literature and how important it was. And here's a literature professor from a college talking about the thing she was literally doing with her 7th graders. And it made me so proud of her.
I love that for so many reasons. As someone who has a collection of multicolored flare pens for the specific purpose of marking up books, like with hearts or smileys or question marks or arrows or just underlines or whatever it is, like just to, for me, kinesthetically, like mark things in a book is really important. And if I get through, usually it's only half a book, because I don't finish if I don't mark stuff in the book.
Yes.
But there's just something about a book that moves you to mark it, or to write down questions, or to tag something, and then to turn to someone else and say, what about this?
Yes.
I mean, that's the mark of a great book, right?
It is. I read a book, not this summer, but last summer, that one of my students gave me. And when a student gives me a book, I have to read it. I have to read the whole thing. And it was an unusual book. And when I finished, I was so profoundly disturbed by this book that I needed to talk to someone, but I didn't know anyone who had read it. And I certainly was not going to hand it to someone else and say, please read this so we can talk about it, because it was so profoundly disturbing. Like, I don't want to choose that for one of my people. So I went on the internet and I was like, hey, has anyone read this book? I need to talk about it.
Goodreads. Yeah.
And on I wanted to talk to people I knew. So on Facebook, many of my former students are my friends, and they had a lot to say about it, but most of them had read the author, but not that specific text. So I actually never got the satisfaction, because I couldn't turn to someone, like you said. And that's the beauty of reading in community in a classroom where we're all working on the same task.
I love that. And I love this notion of, instead of answering the questions, you create the questions.
Yes.
That's such a deeper level of thinking.
It is. And actually that's a little trick I have sometimes to review before a test or a quiz. I have my students write their own quizzes, and then they can like quiz, trade, move around, talk to each other. And so they're reviewing, but probably like 8 out of 10 times, the questions they have come up with are the questions that I will come up with. They're the same thing, which tells me really where they are as readers, and that they're zeroing in on like the major symbols or that type of thing that we kind of have to test in an AP class. But it's such a great way to see how they're learning and what they're learning and how they're interacting.
Right. And to get really deep into a character.
Yes.
Right? In fiction, what the sort of whys of a character.
Mm-hmm.
Why this choice? Why do they keep going back to this, or whatever the why is? It tells us so much about just people and human behavior and motivation. And I mean, it's how we understand ourselves and others, isn't it?
Absolutely. Because it's easier to question a creation on a piece of paper than to question your own behavior or your sister's behavior or your, crush's behavior, or even your teacher's behavior. But once you are ushered into how to question it about a character, now you realize that's the questioning you should be doing about everyone around you. What are their motives? Why are they behaving this way? What am I supposed to understand based on this behavior? And then it's like a key in a lock to the world in a lot of ways.
And I love how it sort of breeds empathy. So even for a character who's unlikable,
Mm-hmm.
I could think about Ahab and Moby Dick, right? If there's some tiny bit of empathy you have for that character, then you can have empathy for almost anyone.
Exactly. And it's an exercise. I think you have to learn that. I don't know that. I mean, you know better about little kids than I do, but I don't think it's just natural to automatically have empathy. I think you learn it by seeing it in other people, your parents, your family, the people around you, and your community, and you're taught that. So it's a great way to practice if you're practicing with literature, even your second graders. Who do they care about? Who are they feeling that empathy for? And then you can actually teach them the word and teach them the purpose of empathy and how it expands them as people.
Yes, and even for sort of unlikable characters, as some of them in The Outsiders were, but we had empathy for like Cherry.
Right, exactly.
By the end. But even for my little second graders, we would read, and I wish I could remember the title, but my mind is blank. But it was The Tale of the Three Little Pigs told from the wolves' perspective.
Yes.
Love that book. I want to say it's the true story of the three little pigs, but it's something like that. Mm-hmm. And if you can develop some empathy for the wolf who was tormented by these obnoxious pigs,
right,
then you can be empathetic for almost anyone.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. So I don't know. I think we're selling kids short by not letting them engage with literature, like confining them to excerpts or all nonfiction is really, I think, blocking an important part of their development.
Absolutely. And growing that love for books and art and all of the things that make us better humans.
Yes.
Yep. And so my question, I think at this point is, who gets to decide what young people can read?
I think the aim of this law, of course, this is me trying to understand other people's behavior without a lot of information. There's no book I can read to help me understand the Florida legislature. But I think the aim of this law is to answer that question with parents.
But why? Okay, so here's my question, which is a rhetorical question.
Mm-hmm.
I have two kids, right? My kids are adults now. They were both in your literature class, both read amazing books and pieces of literature, which made them better humans. I mean, they're pretty amazing humans now as adults. I don't know that they would be as empathetic and thoughtful as they are had they not been readers in high school. Why does someone else's parent get to choose what my kids read?
I think that's a really important question that a lot of people are asking themselves in Florida right now.
Yeah. And why does someone's parent get to choose what my child's literature teacher can teach or maybe go to jail for?
Right. And it's not like in 24 years, I have had parents not like certain pieces of literature that we were learning. I've had those conversations. I've had to give alternate texts as well. And that's fine. That's okay. I understand. You have the right to choose for your child. I remember one year I was teaching I believe it was Heart of Darkness. And there's a Simpsons video, one of their episodes, which is basically Heart of Darkness, but in a very Simpsons way.
Know that.
Oh, yes. Yes. Homer ends up on an island, and you can imagine.
I'm just going to say I didn't watch a lot of Simpsons, but I may have to check that one.
Have to find that one. And I remember, like, okay, we're going to queue up and we're going to watch this video. And I remember a student saying, I'm not allowed to watch The Simpsons. And I was like, okay.
That I can understand.
That's fine. Absolutely. Okay. You go ahead and run next door. It's going to be like 15 minutes to watch this. And then you can come back. And it was really transparent. Nobody cares. You're not allowed to watch The Simpsons. I'm not allowed to read Harry Potter. I'm not allowed to, drink whole milk, whatever. Nobody cares. We just all are kind of on our own
we get
path.
By, right.
Yeah.
Right. But when your restrictions restrict my child's learning,
right,
that's when I get concerned. Right? Like,
yeah,
you can choose, but you can't. Why are you choosing for my child? And I have to wonder in Florida, what will happen when kids now move on to college? Like, as a professor, if you're not allowed to read Shakespeare in high school, what's going to happen when you get to college English? I don't know.
So I actually have had a lot of conversation on that vein with a parent who said, how are Florida students going to go to Ivy League schools? How are they going to go anywhere out of the state? And we really kind of came to an agreement that in-state schools will be dealing with all of their students. Basically, I don't know. I haven't done the research. Let's assume 80% of the students at Florida State University come from Florida. They're all going to be on the same page. They will all have that like sort of restricted knowledge when they get there. The problem is if they leave Florida.
Oh. Wow.
I know. I've had students at Harvard, at Stanford, at
Penn. I mean,
yeah.
anywhere.
Oh, Penn State, absolutely.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. And they can do it. They are prepared. I don't know about in 4 or 5 years how well prepared our kids will be.
I mean, if you can't read any literature that makes you uncomfortable, then how prepared are you?
Yeah.
For life? I don't know. It's concerning.
It is. So I have hope. I met a young man at open house and I said, here's the plan. Don't go out and buy these books because, we're banning books in Florida now. And I don't want you to buy something that we're not going to use. All of this is subject to change. And he got very stuck on banning books. And he was very concerned about banning. Why are we banning books? Who's banning books? How do we stop the banning? And I said, very soon you will be a voter. And you have to vote for people who don't ban books. That's it. That's the only way. The only way is to, and I know that there are so many things that go into voting for so many people, and we all vote based on our priorities. But if you're not down with banned books, then don't vote for people who ban books.
Yeah. Well, you and I on this podcast talk to educators so much about focusing on what you can control.
Exactly.
Because we've got to guard our energy. We're in a profession that requires a lot of energy, and we don't have energy to spend on things that are outside of our control.
Right.
But you're right. We vote. Mm-hmm. We advocate. We do what we can in the context that we're in,
yes,
to set our students up for success in college and life, to set them up to be people who love reading, people who are empathetic, people who understand other people, and however we have to navigate that right now.
Right. So we have a friend who has 4 children in her house, and one is a junior, one's starting freshman year. And she said to me, great, now I have to teach AP Lit at home. Right. So there's a parent who understands and is not just going to like let their children swim along, but now I have to pick that up. And so I think that there will be parents who do that as well.
Hope so.
Yeah.
Like as a parent of young adults, I don't know. I'm going to try to say this without getting like weepy, because you know I'm a weeper anyway. But who would my kids be if they hadn't read of Mice and Men or the things they carried? Like they would not be the empathetic humans that they are had they not, because there's no way they would have been exposed to those kind of contexts except through books. And thank God they weren't exposed to those situations in their lives. But we want them to understand, and we want them to be able to handle the things that come their way. And so we can do that through art. And that's the bottom line. Yeah. Oh, so educator friends, parent friends, we are in challenging times. Like we're navigating some really murky, difficult waters here, especially our educators in states like Florida.
And let's remember that it's not just Florida. Florida is where I am, and Florida is what's in the news right now. But this is happening in many, many states. I had an AP Lit teacher from Alaska say, there's a bill in our house just like this right now.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in North Carolina, we're sort of on edge waiting for things like this to see if they come down. So we've got to advocate for literature, for art, for our teachers, for our kids, and just keep going, navigate the best we can, focus on what we can control.
And I think we have to do it for Johnny.
Oh, say it.
I'm gonna do it. Let's do it for Johnny. Let's do it for Johnny.
Oh, I see Hinton.
Yes,
we love
you.
She understood.
Forever. She understood, and that was Dallas. He understood as well. Sometimes you have to do it for Johnny. It's not for you. And even people who don't have kids or who aren't educators on the front lines of this, you still have to do it for Johnny. We need you.
Yeah. Oh, what a great place to end. Educators, stick in there.
Yep.
It's a tough time, but we'll come out the other side. We will get through this together. We are here supporting you, supporting kids, supporting art, cheering you on. So let's keep going, friends. Let's keep going.
Yep. One foot in front of the other. Have a great week, friends.
Bye.
Thank you so much for joining us. We hope you will subscribe to the Lessons That Last podcast wherever you listen. Give us a rating too, which will help other listeners find us. And don't forget to visit chalkandchances.com for more stories. You can also find more information on Julie's research and books. While you're there, take the quiz to find out what kind of memorable teacher you are. I took it and was surprised by what I found. I think you'll find good food for thought. Let us know about your quiz results. We hope you will meet us here each week and bring a friend to share the conversation.